afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Reimagining Places and Spaces. So this conversation is about many things, but mostly is about exploring the potential of physical, the digital,
Afternoon, everyone, and welcome
the
to
hybrid mediums.
Reimagining Places and Spaces.
Welcome
So
to Reimagining Places.
conversation is about many things, but mostly is about exploring the potential of physical, the digital. Afternoon,
Echo going on and on and on.
Is about many things, but mostly is about exploring the potential of physical, the digital.
Okay, I will try that again because it looks like there was a lot of echo. So again, welcome to Reimagining Places and Spaces. And this is going to be a great conversation about exploring the different and potential pros and cons of the physical, the digital, and the hybrid mediums and platforms for making arts, not just arts for the sake of art, but making it more accessible and making it a better experience. So we're gonna cover a few different topics, and we have a few questions for our panels. So we're gonna go and introduce our panel, and then you get to meet these really wonderful people. So first, we welcome Jessa Agilo. Jessa is the founder, the president, and the CEO of Arts Pond. So she's queer, she's disabled, integrated arts producer, entrepreneur with not 1 decade, but 3 decades of careers in the arts and culture. I find that very, very interesting because looks too young for 3 decades, but I'm not judging, I'm actually complimenting. Jessa is passionate as an advocate for critical access and inclusion, which is very critical. It's a very important conversation, and for equity-seeking groups of all kinds. So thank you and welcome, Jessa. Next, we have Menon Dwarka. Menon Dwarka is the Senior Vice President of Arts Consulting Group and has held numerous arts leadership positions in Canada and the United States. So this is over the last 25 years, and his experience is probably something that is coming very handy these days because it has to do about leveraging technology in the service of creating more diverse programming and administrative spaces. So this is a conversation that was very important before, but when the pandemic began, I'm sure you were very busy, men, answering all kinds of questions. And then we have Mojan Jianfar, and Mojan is the Senior Cultural Affairs Officer at the City of Toronto. Mojan is an urban planner working in the intersection of arts, culture, and city building. She has led award-winning public art and cultural planning projects. So what a great way to start the afternoon with this wonderful panel and experts in many different subjects related to our conversation. So welcome, Mojan, welcome, Jessa, welcome, Menon, and welcome to all of you that are participating, watching, and hoping to engage with us in this wonderful afternoon. So now, let's get to it, shall we? Are you excited? Let's go. So I'm going to ask the first question, and I'm going to ask you to, take a few minutes to tell us sort of broadly, how do you see in your own communities and your own workspaces, and even in your own mind, how do you see the arts evolved during the pandemic? So how about I start with Mojan?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Isabel. So, I mean, I can speak on it from some perspectives, and I think the interesting thing that's evolved, there's been some pros and cons for sure, and some of the interesting things that have evolved is just seeing the unique ways that audiences have been engaged in the arts, whether, using digital platforms or digital spaces for people to be able to participate in ways that they might not have previously been able to participate, from home or from their own spaces. And I think that's been an interesting thing, that we're seeing some of that kind of continuing in a hybrid of participation, sort of allowing people to attend events in person, but also virtually. And that's been something interesting that I do hope continues, kind of exploring how these spaces can be more accessible for people to attend in a multitude of ways. And obviously there's been, a lot of unfortunate impacts from the pandemic, seeing a lot of loss of venues and a lot of loss of spaces for culture, particularly because, it is a sector that is dependent on audiences coming out to experience and to be, within the art and culture sphere. So there's been some pros and cons. I'm sure, others have other ideas on this in terms of how it's evolved. I'll kick it off with that and add some more as we continue this question.
Sounds great. Thank you. How about you, Menon? What do you think? What do you think about arts evolving?
Well, I might say that the art forms in general, I don't think there's been a tremendous amount of evolution in the actual way we produce art. I think it's just been an accelerant of how we deliver. Because much of the technology that we had, even Zoom was around before the pandemic, but it's just people had to grasp new ways to reach audiences, or even, I'll be super kind of blunt here, they had to justify their audience count for granting organizations, and everyone felt very much, well, how do we share our wares, as it were, with the general public if they can't gather? But for me, and this might be, I might be jumping ahead to another question, but I think for me, one of the things that's really interesting, so in the work that I do, it's cross-border, right? We find, and we work with organizations to do cultural planning and strategic plans, but also employment. In one of the firms that I just spoke to last week, is looking for a potential new COO, they come from a company in Toronto based called Starvox Entertainment. They do a lot of kind of Broadway type musical shows. But when they reached out to me, they weren't talking to me about that company. They were talking about an immersive technology company. And the chat was fairly quickly got to the point where they said, oh, those immersive Van Gogh shows, we do those. And I thought, oh, that's amazing. You're based in Toronto. And she said, yeah, we've got 20 markets in the States, and we've got one here. I said, how did you guys end up doing that? And she said, oh, it was just a Hail Mary pivot during the pandemic. They weren't a technology company. They weren't an immersive technology company at all before, right? They just put on good old-fashioned Broadway shows. They needed to make money. They thought this might be a good way. And if memory serves me right, I think at the height of the pandemic, they did one of these shows as a drive-through so that you could be with your family and not worry about getting exposed to the virus by being in place. So for me, there have been some accelerants in the culture. I mean, I think on HBO, there's a show right now called We Met in Virtual Reality, about people being open and willing to meet in these virtual spaces. But to me, the real thing about the pandemic was that the accelerant of how people were so willing to adopt these things. And I have to say, and again, I'm trying to be mindful of taking up too much space in the room. When that Rogers outage happened a couple of weeks ago, oh my God, did my whole world just come crashing down? Because I realized I'd been kind of isolated for 2 years. My staff at a previous organization and my wife were always saying, get out of that chair and walk around, and I realized that the illusory nature of being connected via technology has had lots of great things, but it also is not the same as being actually in a room with people and having real connection. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Now, Jessa, back to you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Lovely to be here. I just want to acknowledge that I live and work on the Treaty 13 territories, it's very, very important to just acknowledge and celebrate the long history of positive stewardship and care and respect for the land that Indigenous peoples are asking us to join them. And so I do in allyship and in trying to change my own behavior. So this question about the pandemic and evolution, I want to acknowledge that the pandemic is not over. For me, as an immunocompromised person, and looking at the latest science about COVID, that there is no cure, perhaps in my lifetime, in the history of cures of major illnesses, that I might be living with COVID for the rest of my life. And there's some. I was a real stalwart in the beginning. I just leaped in and launched a mutual aid network and just, okay, I don't just go work first 2 years. But now after 2 years and thinking longer term, I'm starting to have some mental health challenges personally. And there are lots of people who are still struggling with that, struggling to maintain their well-being enough to survive, let alone evolve. And there's so many systemic issues that have been exacerbated by the pandemic that were a problem before and will continue after, and are just deeper. And the urgency of our times, perhaps one of the most complicated crises, multiple crises, intersectional issues that we perhaps experienced ever in the history of modern humanity. Whether it's precarity and unaffordability and inaccessibility of housing, inequality and colonialism. The Pope is here, and many think not making adequate enough apologies and recognition of the history of that. Inflation and war and the climate crisis and corporate greed and challenges of digital. There's a lot of issues that's going on during and being exacerbated by the pandemic. The capacity and readiness, I also like to say, to evolve, I think, is a privilege. The prospect of evolution, rather than just pure survival, is accessible only to those with the social, economic, political, physical, emotional, and increasingly in the subsequent two questions we have, a digital and spatial power and privilege to access the resources, the knowledge, the well-being and support that enable us to or those folks with power and privilege to experiment and pivot and grow, i.e. evolve, instead of just trying to find ways to survive. And clearly with, the I Lost My Gig survey results, with Canadian Heritage recent artist and content creators survey, artists are struggling to survive. 63% from the Canadian Heritage survey suggested that they're going to continue their creative work, but almost 1/5, 18%, are moving into new creative media or new occupations. 11% are presenting their work differently, including digitally, but not necessarily well. 4% are moving into a completely different creative occupation, and 3%, as of in the last year, said they're quitting. And I have countless number of friends that have left the country to South America and elsewhere, where it's affordable to live. And so this is a real huge issue. I hate to be, a negative person, but I'd like to start and just acknowledge that these are tough times. I think there are some positive directions that are happening in terms of evolution, but the challenge right now is whether these evolutions are positive overall, are going to be sticky, and do not actually further embed or further entrench the systemic inequalities that we already are faced with. I just mentioned a few, and I can mention some others as we go. I think overall, in the present moment, access to art is more democratic. People with disabilities have been able to attend and participate in arts activities and lobby for greater inclusion in ways that they've never been able to prior, because everyone is offering digital alternatives. Families that couldn't afford childcare are going to see perhaps more or engaging more in artistic experiences digitally, because they're not needing to pay for childcare. I think there's perhaps an improved appreciation for art because of the dependence on art in the early days for our survival and addressing pure boredom and being stuck at home. But I have real concerns about whether that's going to be sticky or not. I don't think it's going to be sticky. There's still just a general declining overall appreciation, engagement in the arts as people age, I think. I'm really encouraged by the possibility of greater new kinds of conversations, unlikely partnerships that are happening because of digital. As a national organization with, a small office here in Toronto and staff across Canada, we're doing things that wouldn't have been possible pre-pandemic, with the assumption that, I used to have 9 staff working out of my house. Now I have 40 staff working, up to 40 staff working all across the country. And just my own mindset and thinking, okay, we'll go 100% digital. And it's okay to do that and hire people and work digitally. Just we're working that much more closely, I think, and nationally in ways perhaps we haven't had before. And I have lots more, but I'll stop there. Thanks so much.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Jessa. You touched on so many important points that I feel like we can just move to the next question before continuing this conversation. I mean, so many of those points have to be addressed. And I think one of them is about mental health of the entire ecosystem of the arts right now, from the people who worked as tech crews to the people who worked in venues. There was a big change for many of us that felt also the brunt of how to respond to the question that Menon brought up, which is economic development. When you have to put the numbers in your grants, and then all of a sudden, for so many years now, so much of the arts ecosystem has been dependent on how much you can show economic development. And then all of a sudden, you have venues that are empty. You have festivals that are hybrid now. You lose corporate sponsorship because sponsors don't care if somebody in South America sees your festival. They care only how they're going to turn that into the person going to buy a rug at their shop, right? You touched also, Jessa, on the leadership. And the leadership, how can this be addressed when you have all these systematic problems that prevent us from first of all, take care of the well-being of the workers, of the people who are creating, the creators. If they don't have a safe place to live or affordable, how are we addressing some of those systematic issues so that we don't create a world that is so disbalanced between the people who are able to navigate technology and they are able to pivot versus the people who cannot? And when it comes to, for example, materials, even after, and you're right, this is not over. We're still in a situation where a lot of people are afraid to come out still to public places. How do you have artists that cannot compete when everyone is right now ready to tour, for example? And there are artists that during the pandemic were not able to create, were not able to put out music, create good videos, take care of their websites. It puts a lot of people in a disadvantage, right? So you touched also on the idea that for the first time, many more people are mindful of being inclusive, right? Not only closed captioning, descriptive video. Now we are able to put on programming that someone with less economic advantage and mobility issues can enjoy, and can enjoy without having to get the leftovers, but actually something of substance. there's so many things, Jessa. Thank you so much for everything that you said. So what about we just take a few minutes, Menon and Mojan, and you just get in there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I always love talking with Jessa about this stuff and others as well. She's a great voice in the community for a lot of these things. So, I mean, I think it's definitely been one of the challenges where, I can speak more specifically from a physical infrastructure standpoint where, we have been seeing the loss of venues and the loss of spaces where arts and culture takes place. So, we've been seeing the loss of rehearsal studios in Toronto or music venues, and a lot of these spaces that are traditionally dependent on audiences coming to those spaces to be able to generate revenue to sustain these spaces. So it's definitely like from a more systemic standpoint, like there is a lot of displacement that's going on as a result of the pandemic. I mean, these issues were happening prior to COVID and they've been exacerbated because of the pandemic. And it's things where, we have to take a systemic approach to say, how can we ensure that we're, making these spaces viable in the long run against future issues and kind of how do we keep these spaces running if we relating just back to space and place, but there's a lot to kind of pick up on what Jessa was talking about as well, especially when it comes to this disparity around, the digital platforms and the technology is not necessarily available to all organizations to kind of pick up on. And like not a lot of the smaller organizations or smaller artists or arts groups didn't necessarily weren't able to take advantage of some of those digital platforms. And so they weren't able to do hybrid things or provide alternative engagement during the pandemic either. So I think I was reading something, just so you were mentioning a lot of stats, and I was looking at something recently where I'd be curious to see what the data is for Toronto or Ontario or Canada in general, because this was from the UK. But the UK had done some studies to see that actually, even though these digital platforms kind of improved accessibility and reach of audiences, it seemed that it was still engaging the same audience that would have kind of come to in-person activities. So it's interesting to see, well, how can we use those to actually be reaching audiences that might not have come out before, or like what is still the barrier to access? So anyway, I'll leave it at that. I don't know, Menon, if you have other thoughts or ideas. I mean, there's a lot. We can just flip the script entirely for a whole hour conversation.
Maybe I'll just add a couple of things. Just one practical thing, what Jessa talked about mental health. And Jessa's probably heard me say this before in public talks. I'm pretty open about this, that one of the benefits of our healthcare system here in Canada is that if you can find a therapist who's also an MD, those services are covered by our Ontario healthcare system. I see probably one of the best therapists in the country twice a week, and it's supported by national healthcare, which is great. And I would advise. I think my cautionary thing about this is I know artists are very scrappy and resourceful and love to find ways to do things, but there are other people who can help us. And sometimes we need to reach out to adjacent and ancillary industries to pick up the slack. So anyone that is, I mean, it's like I want to be very clear on what I'm saying. If you Google a therapist and you see the letters MD after their name, write them and see if you can't get an appointment, because that will be supported on your Ontario health card. The other thing I might want to just say is that, without being super cliche of like, it's the, quoting that it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. In some strange way, the salaries for lots of art workers have been going through the roof due to at this point in the pandemic, because we're slightly emerging. I will adopt Jess's language about us not being through it yet, but because we're at this certain point, And my goodness, development directors in particular, the people who raise money, are able to write their own ticket right now in the States. The firm that I'm working with has grown by a third since in a year because of the demand. So I want to be, what I would love to do is in what I think I'm doing in the long arc of my career is joining the two ends of the really well-resourced arts sector and the one that's more grassroots, and figuring out a way that they can share resources and become part of each other. Because if you know how to get the money, that's great. But I'm a guy of a certain age. I remember very early in my career the absolute sweat and terror of fearing the end of the month coming along and having to pay rent and figuring out how to do this as someone who's in the arts. So I think if there could be a really much more robust conversation about, and I'll end with this. There were so many film productions that I saw during the last year, especially at the height of pandemic, people trying to reach their audiences. And in a whole lifetime ago, I was a composer of music for TV. I lived in New York. The amount of kind of basic structural issues in producing a video, even things as simple as syncing audio and video together. We're in one of the major media resource cities on the planet, and yet we weren't bringing those industry individuals in to come and help us and say, hey, we're making this video, could you advise us? I'd really like to figure out how to do that, because I think if we made stuff that was comparable in quality and execution, that more people, to what Mojan was saying earlier, that we want to expand this audience. And since Disney Plus and Netflix and YouTube have these enormous audiences, how do we leverage those platforms to get more people to see interesting artwork? So I'll stop there.
Well, I have the feeling that we can go into so many different directions, but for the sake of this hour, and I think this conversation needs to go on. For that reason, you can find Jessa's, Menon, Mojan, even my own bio in the conference website as well, because I think this is a fountain of information and resources that you have, and I think it kind of needs to be shared with the world, if you ask me. I'm in St. Jacobs, Ontario, in a rural place. I live in Conestoga, 4 minutes away. I live surrounded by Mennonites. Our idea here, and by the way, I never even introduced myself. I got so excited, I just went right in. And my name is Isabel Cisterna. I'm the founder, artistic director of Neruda Arts. And we've been working in this small community of the region of Waterloo for 20 years now, right? But what it started as a kind of a result of trying to make access for our own selves, when we were professional artists that were new Canadians, and we couldn't see ourselves anywhere. We had to start making space, and with our, little elbows, it's like, move a little bit, give me some room, right? Doing it in a smaller place can have the difficulties. And this brings me to the conversation of gentrification, spaces versus places, because you could have lots of spaces. It doesn't mean that those spaces speak to you or that you feel welcome to. You may not belong there. Places that are affordable, inclusive, and that's kind of like the difference between rural Ontario, rural Canada, and urban. How many more venues there are in Toronto, for example, versus here that we don't have hardly any venues. How we have turned, in a way, the city means art and the rural places look a little barren. And yet there are so many rural areas that are rich in tradition, right? So my question to all of you is, the role of gentrification that is played in the arts, and how this has affected communities like ours, for example, where all of a sudden all these tech companies arrived in Waterloo for the last few years. They basically they take all the spaces that arts were, being created. So we, as a result of the tech companies, and which was a very big carrot that was dangled in our face. When the tech companies come, we're going to have all this economic development, and this will translate into more spaces for artists, more opportunities, more revenue, more sponsorship. But nothing has happened. Like, it couldn't be opposite from the truth. What had happened in turn was the tech companies took the spaces, became gentrified with all the new tech workers who work inside. All the coffee shops are inside their own buildings. Their lunches are brought to them, so they have nothing to do with the community at all. And all the prices of all the different buildings that we were using, because they were the cheaper ones, were raised, because now they're turned into these really cool tech companies' hubs. By the way, most of them are sitting half empty now, right? And that drew all the artists elsewhere, from Kitchener to Waterloo, from Waterloo to San Jacob, from San Jacob to Conestoga, Conestoga to Elmira. It's like we're being chased by the gentrification, and we can afford to produce, present, and create. So my perception and my perspective comes from rural. How do you feel wherever your world is and your communities? Gentrification has affected the way that you see the arts. And how about I start with Jessa?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. In 2017, near the first couple of years of Arts Pond, I self-identified myself as a gentrifier, and I wasn't a happy thing. It was a realization that I live in an artscape building in the midst of the second most rapidly gentrifying neighborhood in Toronto, and I acknowledge that okay, the building that used to live, the artist that used to live in the manufacturing warehouse that's on the land where the building I am now, were displaced. And most of them don't live in this neighborhood at all. One or two, I think, still are, but the vast majority were displaced. And I'm the cause, literally, because I bought a unit on the land where that 48 Abel Street used to be. So this question of whether there's a lot of blame going around, shall we say? Are artists to blame? Are technologists to blame? Are government to blame? Everyone is really complicit in different ways to the reality of gentrification and its adverse effects and its more positive ones. Carl Grodash is a researcher out of the US that's been did some work a number of years ago, trying to discover a correlation, whether arts and creative industries have a positive association to creating gentrification, i.e. gentrification results as of their activities, or there's a negative correlation. And some of his work looking at kind of film and commercial music, design, creative industries, was that those commercial arts are more likely to locate in places that are undergoing gentrification. So there's a small correlation that he discovered, a positive correlation. But other, like fine arts and museums and galleries, so performing arts, visual arts, tend to situate themselves in neighborhoods that are already gentrified because they're attracted to the wealthy audience base. And so there's a negative correlation there. Take that as you will. But there are very interesting and terrible examples of where artists have been co-opted by developers, including through creative placemaking, have been co-opted as a positive force to what David Ley called the expeditionary force for inner city gentrifiers. i.e. the broker of like fashionable middle class taste, moving into a neighborhood that is historically working class, manufacturing based, indigenous, Black, racialized, disability communities, having long histories living there, and they may appear depressed from a middle class or upper class point of view, but still very vibrant and lovely, beautiful communities that experience, say, disinvestment from government to attract future development. So disinvestment from government is one driver of gentrification. Financialization of real estate due to speculative investment, whether it's foreign or otherwise. Taxing and zoning policies are a big contributor. Wealth disparity, great inequality between those that don't have money and those that do, and very low vacancy rates and decontrol around vacancy and deregulation around that. It's all implicated in gentrification. And so the story of gentrification is one of great harm. There's a lot of displacement through rent evictions and dem evictions. There's a lot of disengagement in public policy and urban planning, and lack of sense of place and belonging, because there's an appearance of lack of community engagement and community power around deciding what gets built and what doesn't get built. But on a positive side, like artists do revitalize, and that can be seen as negative, but no, artists do bring a positive energy to communities. It's just whether it's done in a respectful and mindful way of the folks that have lived there prior to them, I think is the biggest concern. So I have lots more I could add, but I'll stop there for now.
I'm going to invite Menon now to tell us how he feels about this.
Well, for me, this term is super complex, because I think when we think about gentrification, it's kind of narrow. It's kind of narrow in describing how communities are, for lack of a better word, infiltrated by people who aren't currently there, and what changes happen. My ancestral heritage is even though I was born in the Caribbean, my ancestors go back to India. And I'm thinking about, would we use the word gentrification when we talk about the massive South Asian population that's gone into Brampton, and how it's changed the culture of that city, and has their economic impact or lack thereof on that city? Does that constitute positive or negative gentrification, right? These things are very, very complicated. And I think for me, one of the ways I like to organize this kind of thought is to think about the porousness of narratives, in that we have an idea about what a neighborhood or community looks like or should look like, whether it's held within or externally. And then when those values and the idea of who possesses belongingness start to mix with other communities, it's naturally a disruptive force. And depending on how we measure our own values, whether we measure ourselves by economic fulcrums or pure numbers, or even something as simple as, oh, there's a place to eat down the street that actually is similar to what my mom make, our impact in the community is very complicated. To me, the gentrification of the arts in general, I think what we say when we mean that is, are the arts skewed towards richer, whiter, more established audiences? But I might want us to think about the problem isn't necessarily keeping out rich white folks from an audience. What may be more constructive is to think about, how can we create spaces in which multiple narratives of people coming into the space could feel welcome and at home? That I think, and I've talked about this too, I think even the last time I was at this conference, I talked about this, even this way that we're presented in these boxes, and we're all forward facing, we have certain kind of lighting. certain kind of noise level around us. That's all. We all share a value about how something should be presented. And for me, if we're going to capture a more grassroots level organization of the arts, I think allowing multiple narratives to come into this space so that we don't exclude the rich white folks who might be able to purchase a ticket, but also have other people come in. And I might just put out there too, that in the story of gentrification, when we think about LGBTQ communities revitalizing neighborhoods across North America, making them quote unquote more beautiful spaces and more arts friendly spaces, I'm not going to answer this, but I think thinking about the net benefit and the net contribution to the arts ecosystem is something that we should not necessarily castigate those folks as being bad because they maybe are majority white, but maybe it's that with their introduction to a new space, multiple new narratives could come in, and a new kind of turning over of the soil could happen. So why don't I just stop there, and I'll turn it to Mojan.
Could we say, Menon, that it has to do with the ability of the communities to give, and so it's a give and take, and it's not just about coming into a space and just taking from others, displacing others, but it's the ability of a community to be healthy, to have the well-being of everyone's at heart, and to be able to make space for other people. Because see, this is an interesting thing, as you said, about space that can be revitalized can also become safer spaces, right? Rather than the dark alley that people are afraid of. It can be more beautiful, but it usually comes with someone, an like a community that is coming in, giving back. And I think that's where sometimes we see that narrative of negativity, because there is only one story to this, and it's a sad story, right?
Maybe Isabel, maybe I'll just add one quick thing that you made me think about, just in terms of how to build those bridges between these communities. So I think oftentimes we don't have folks who are can hold multiple narratives in their space as curators or as organizers in the field. Because one of the things when I'm talking to civic institutions or large institutions or even grassroots groups is that when we think about, so my background, I come out of I'm trained as a composer, like Jessa is too. We come out of a certain tradition, and one of the things I talk about is if you're going to put one work of classical music tradition that's kind of the centerpiece, could arguably be Beethoven's Ninth. And in the last movement, there's this place where you have very like fife and drum music, cymbals and some flutes playing. So it turns out that Beethoven was drawing upon the music of these folks called the Janissary bands, and they were captured Serbian and Croatian troops who played in these military bands. And I often say, if you want to talk about the intersection of Islam and the West, and brotherhood and class and structural slavery and war, it's in this chestnut. It's in this most whitest Europeanist art form that we have. And what we need to do is have people who could say to somebody, hey, we know you come from a region of the world that was ravaged by war, and that some of your folks were co-opted by armies. This Beethoven work is about that story. We'll help you unpack it and talk about it, but and I just feel like under the surface there's so many of these connectors, but we're just trying to put on a show half the time. We're just trying to keep the lights on. We don't have energy, resources, time to do this work, but I think it's the most important work that we can do. So sorry about that.
So we're gonna have to give Mojan some time to also chime in, and then we need to ask our audience, their thoughts and what they're thinking about. So if you have a question, start thinking about it, and you can type it in the comment little part of your screen, and we'll be happy to address some of those comments and questions from the audience. So, Mojan.
I mean, I can just add more generally just the impacts of gentrification on city building and development and kind of things that we've seen around the built form. I mean, issues for access to space have been, unfortunately, a long-term issue that we've been seeing, that's been a top issue, at least in Toronto, and that we're seeing now, Isabel, as you were explaining earlier, it's been like growing and kind of chasing in other cities and towns and communities as well. And so we've been seeing a lot. One of these impacts really of gentrification is the development pressures that we're seeing on spaces and places for arts and culture. And, we're seeing that around affordability challenges and how to be able to sustain these spaces and rising property values and taxes and all those things. And unfortunately seeing a huge loss of space where arts and culture can take place as a result of a lot of this gentrification and displacement. And in addition to that, we're seeing a lot of sort of inequitable access to space around the city. So it's very much concentrated in the downtown core, where there are maybe some more, let's say, like established arts organizations or spaces, and we're not seeing that equal distribution of space to other areas. I mean, I can speak about Toronto specifically. I'm not familiar with other municipalities in Ontario, but you're seeing that sort of that how gentrification also plays out from a geography standpoint when it comes to who has access to space, where these spaces are, where they're being developed, where new spaces are being developed, and where others are either being lost and not replaced. So we're seeing a lot of that as well as a result of gentrification too, where a lot of the concentration tends to be more in the downtown core, and how can we help make that a more equitable distribution, specifically for equity deserving groups outside of the downtown core who have been struggling to access space. And, we're seeing a lot of this stuff also kind of, we're seeing, I mean, I can talk about legislation and policy, and Jessa knows this too, because, I'm more of a planning nerd from that perspective. And, we're seeing changes in the growth funding tools that we have in order to be able to develop these new spaces and sustain these spaces. So these are kind of the other elements of gentrification as well, in terms of how gentrification is also impacting the physical environment and access to these places and spaces for arts and culture. I'll leave it at that, so you can kind of open it up to questions from our audience too.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mojan. Okay, folks, this is your time to ask your questions or let us know what you think. Now, perhaps in the meantime, while somebody is typing, hopefully, one of the things that I think about myself, and this very particular time that we're living in, is that our people perspective changed during the pandemic. A friend of mine said to me not too long ago, you know what, everyone has a friend who never goes to anything artistic or any kind of performance. And I'm always trying to bring him in, and, I don't know why, but he doesn't. And he said to me the other day that one of the first things that he thought during the pandemic was how much he had taken the arts for granted. He had no idea how much of his daily life was impacted by arts. He didn't appreciate it. He didn't really thought for a second that he had an understanding or an appreciation or a love for. And that he said it was thanks to this time to reflect, this time of silence, that I was able to. And now I'm so interested in going places and supporting the arts for the first time. So I wonder if you can maybe take a minute, all of you, and see if you've had some of those anecdotes where people have changed their perception. Or, we have a question. Wait a second. Let's have this question from Kate Proctor. So Kate asked us, what do you think of the role of arts councils, local, where arts organizations are to influence gentrification of the arts ecosystem locally that ultimately impact the creative arts and their work? So I'm going to ask Mojan first for her reply.
Oh, I was actually thinking of a reply. I don't know if anyone else has a reply to start off. Come back to me.
Okay. Jenna?
I'm happy to start
Yeah.
with some shall I say a gut reaction? So maybe don't quote me on this. All this is
Yes.
recorded. Thanks for the question, Kate. I think it's about power and privilege for me. Arts councils ultimately, for those that get operating and core funding, really those are the only, like in terms of arts organizations, those that get core funding are really the only ones I think that can ultimately afford long-term space, especially in the traditionally gentrifying neighborhoods where most arts organizations live. So I think in terms of funding decisions and how much money gets allocated to different kinds of organizations, and the lack of funding or the lack of equity and inclusion for equity deserving and equity seeking groups historically has been a huge problem. And for even just young organizations trying to find a leg up and get into the sector at all, and particularly in this context, say dance organizations, where they can't make their art without a physical space. They need many other disciplines need space, but dance in particular needs large open spaces that aren't necessarily affordable in this context. So locally, arts councils making decisions about who gets money and who doesn't and how much money they get is, and the lack of funding, growth really long term. Locally, federally, there's been lots of new money. The Toronto Arts Council has doubled its funding envelope in the last decade or so, but it's still not enough to meet the needs of the sector. So I think it's ultimately that the arts councils are a broker of who gets access, who has the privilege and power in order to maintain and sustain a space. And lovely organizations and artists like Peggy Baker deciding not to continue their organization in order to open up funding to new organizations to enter that field is a lovely gesture. And I think the pandemic is going to force a certain number of organizations to close. I have concerns locally that there won't be anyone able to step in to save those spaces, and we're going to lose long-term access to those spaces because the arts organizations are going to need to either close permanently or downsize. And so there's a long-term challenge around no access to space, downtown in particular. And that might force many arts organizations to move into Etobicoke and Scarborough and North York and further gentrify those neighborhoods. So yeah, I think it's just the power and privilege of having access to funding that the local arts councils are the brokers of that.
And if I may, Jenna, for example, in Waterloo region, we don't have an arts council.
Yes.
So that job is always falling in the shoulders of the leadership, mostly of the racialized minority groups that already have so much put on their shoulders. They're spreading themselves thin. But then on top of that, there has been this narrative in this area where, because we don't have an arts council, it's like we don't know how to organize ourselves. We don't know how to collaborate. And then the same folks are the ones that are speaking up. And they are the ones that have become the face of these conversations, right? But because, in a way, one of the things that the Arts Councils did back in the day when we had one, 20 years ago, was that it could be the advocate, but it didn't have to have a face. It was the organization. As for now, those faces are seen as the difficult ones, the people who are trying to be disturbers, right? So personally, I would love to see an arts council in our way so that we could all be part of it. Not everyone in Ontario has one. Toronto has lots of access to lots of places that we don't have here. So interesting. Mojan, if you have had a thought in your head, hold it for just 1 second, just to see if your answer maybe is related to this question. Tammy, she asked us, I would love to see the vacant office spaces in downtown areas in major cities become reclaimed as arts and community center spaces. A pipe dream, perhaps. Is it though? This is perfect question for Mojan.
Well, I was going to add to what Jessa was saying, that there is a movement also towards community land trusts and social purpose real estate, where this could be an interesting opportunity for arts organizations and arts councils to consider, to reimagine how they own spaces, or how spaces can be sort of converted for arts uses. So we're seeing some of that movement in Toronto, as well as in other cities as well, where arts organizations maybe are partnering with faith-based groups or spaces, and kind of converting these spaces into arts and culture uses. And part of this whole social purpose real estate model is really ensuring that these spaces are used for social purpose, or in this particular case for arts and culture, and ensuring that they do sort of remain affordable and sustainable spaces for the community. And so we're also seeing, similar models around the community land trust, where, organizations or residents are kind of coming together to look at co-ownership of space and land. And that could be a really strong or significant role for arts councils and arts organizations to play, as they're seeing their neighborhoods kind of gentrifying and what can happen. And to Tammy's point, just to share, I mean, one of the things that we are doing at City of Toronto is creating this office for creative space. So myself and my colleague Erica are launching this office for creative space. And part of that is really looking at existing spaces within the city's roster that we can kind of open up for arts and culture uses. And, working with private space owners as well to kind of open these spaces up for arts and culture uses. So it might not be a total pipe dream. It could be a reality. It just takes some time to kind of figure out how to do those things. But just another comment to share on the, I'm picking up what Jessa was saying around arts councils and stuff.
Yeah, and Jessa has a good point. Why the arts are always relegated to temporary instead of permanent long-term spaces that cultural land trusts are trying to advocate for. And that should be a panel in itself,
Just on that point, if you don't mind, I'd like to mention the Creative Land Trust out of UK, which was created as a result of an edict, or I don't know if to say, please do, by the Mayor of London. And they've really grown in the last 18 months or so, and they've got some spaces with 999-year lease of the land, which is unheard of. Cultural land trusts are usually fighting for anything between 25 or community land trust is the model it's coming from, fight for anything between 25 to 99-year leases, but 999, that's 20 generations of artists creating work for 50 years. Like, just imagine the new kind of the positive of that, but also the new business models and governance models and funding models and accountability evaluation standards that need to be created for an organization that's responsible for care for something for that many generations into the future. It's a huge bonus and a huge challenge.
Well, folks, I feel absolutely privileged. Speaking of privilege, I feel privileged to have met Jessa and Mojan and also Menon tonight, or today. It's dark in here because it's about to rain. Because you have brought so much to this conversation. I feel that the next time should be with wine of some sort, and then there should be so much more to talk about. If folks are interested, you can ask more questions with the contacts. They have their contacts in the website, and of course, if you do the math, there is over 100 years of experience in this trio. So that should account for something. Thank you so much, Menon and Jessa and Mojan. And I would like to invite everyone to the next panel, because it's the value in the arts. And I think that might be the next conversation about exactly that. What is the value in the arts? Thanks everyone for such a beautiful hour. I feel like it should be a 3-hour panel for sure. And thank you so much to everyone who attended that is interested and engaged in the arts. We need everyone to be an ally to this conversation, because ultimately we want to raise our families in places that are safe, that are healthy, that are engaging, that promote and produce feelings of belonging, right? So we all have a part in this. So thank you so much. Thank you so much.